This is your macroeconomics video on the long run Phillips curve. In the last video, we talked about the short run Phillips curve, which is very similar to the short run aggregate supply line. It's just flipped in the other direction because your horizontal axis on the Phillips curve is talking about unemployment, where on the aggregate supply and demand graph, your horizontal axis is talking about employment or output. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical in the exact same way that a long-run aggregate supply line is vertical, and for the same reasons. So the idea is that everything returns to the vertical line in the long run. And this is because employment levels, or the amount of money that you're paying workers, which are nominal wages, eventually return to the normal or natural rate of unemployment, or what we call full employment, regardless of what the inflation rate is. So there can be time periods where we have an unemployment rate which is lower than our typical natural rate, and sometimes when it is higher than our typical natural rate. But over time, the vertical line represents our long run average for a good economy. And so therefore, even if we have short run changes, we eventually get back to that vertical line. When we were doing double shifts on our short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand graphs, it's typically this second shift which leads you back to having your equilibrium right on top of your vertical long run supply line. The same thing happens here with the Phillips curve. So your long run Phillips curve is vertical for the same reasons, which is classical dichotomy and monetary neutrality in the long run. If price levels change, it only affects the short run. In the long run, wages are going to move to meet the change in prices, and therefore we go back to buying or creating the same amount of supply that we were before. And therefore you get a vertical Phillips curve and a vertical supply line. So here we go. On the left-hand side, we have our aggregate supply and demand graph with a vertical LRAS at the natural rate of output. And on the right-hand side, we have our long-run Phillips curve. Now again, your vertical axis here on the aggregate graph is labeled price level, but on the Phillips curve, we generally label that inflation, and we typically use percentages to label our Phillips curve. The horizontal axis is still the opposite. So on our aggregate graph on the left, we label it Y, which equates to real GDP, output, national income, and employment. But on the Phillips curve, our horizontal axis is unemployment rate, so it is the opposite. That means that the long-run Phillips curve shifts in the opposite direction as the long-run aggregate supply line. So if your aggregate supply line was increasing, your long-run Phillips curve would be decreasing. So let's put in an aggregate demand line here, and then you can see equilibrium level at price level 1. That equilibrium is the same price level that people in the market are expecting, including businesses. So businesses try to figure out what they expect prices will be. They set wages based on that, and they set their business plan based on expected prices they will earn when they sell their products. At this level, we have fairly low inflation. So let's say that we're using monetary policy, and by doing that, we're lowering the interest rate, which is going to increase aggregate demand. We now have a higher price level, and in the long run, we will also get higher amounts of inflation. Now, all of this is based upon the expected rate of inflation or expected price level. Wherever your equilibrium is between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, that is what businesses expect the prices to be. So when they are planning out how many units to make and how many people to hire, they set those things based on that expectation. Now, if that expectation turns out to be wrong, or something happens that changes that particular inflation level or price level, then businesses have to adjust. And this is what we call our short-run shift on our aggregate supply line. So if aggregate demand rises and we have an increase in the aggregate demand line, suddenly price levels have changed and it's no longer at the expected equilibrium that we once had, where businesses were planning their hiring and their setting of wages. So now businesses have to adjust. And again, that is when our nominal rate of wages is going to unstick, and then they're going to give their employees a change in wage, either up or down, based upon where the price level went. That is what we say happens in the long run, or our secondary shift. So this just takes some time for businesses to adjust to a new level of prices or inflation.